Steve Cranack is about to join us. He's actually literally joined us from some product after more than a decade as a product manager for the Excel team at Microsoft, where he directly impacted many features in Excel, including new worksheet functions like ifs and text join, data from picture, Excel for Mac, user experience improvements like smooth scrolling, and many others. Now, prior to this, he was instrumental in leading customer success at a startup, Prodience, who were acquired by Microsoft and their tools integrated into Excel. He has also a decade of experience in the vaccine manufacturing industry. We should ask him about that, where he made his mark by using desktop tools such as Excel to automate and simplify many business processes. Steve brings a passion for listening to customers and helping them succeed by making the most of technology in their data using Excel and, of course, good old Power BI. Let's introduce Steve into it. Good evening, Steve, I think, isn't it?
Yes, it is evening. Welcome, everyone. Happy to be here. Thank you for joining the session. And thanks for that great introduction, Liam.
Oh, you wrote it. It's so we're going to play your video in a second. I don't know if there's anything you would like to introduce just before we do on that, Steve.
No, the video says it all. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. My name is Steve Cranack. I'm a director at Sun Product. I just recently joined the team, but prior to that, I worked on the Excel team at Microsoft as a product manager for the previous 12 years. And one of the things I focused on for the last 5 or 6 years was Excel for Mac. So today I'm going to try to help you answer the question, can I do real work with Excel for Mac? So I'm going to start off with a little bit of trivia. So what was the first version of Excel for Mac? And I won't make you wait for the answer. I'll just point out that Excel 1.0 was released for Macintosh back in 1985, and that was even before Excel was released on Windows. And here I actually was able to find the user guide from that version of Excel, so you can see what it looked like back then. And now, why do we want to talk about Excel for Mac? The reason is because the market share of Mac has been growing. And as we can see here in this report from computerworld.com, 10 years ago, Windows held an almost 86% share of the US desktops, down to Mac's share, which was around 13%. And 10 years later, we see that Windows is down to 54 roughly percent, and Apple has grown to almost 32%. So we only see that trend continuing, and therefore we really need to focus on what you can do with Excel for Mac, because you'll find out many more people are actually using the Mac and need to know what they can do and what the differences are. That Macs are becoming increasingly popular, but why should we talk about using Excel on Mac versus Windows? Why isn't Excel the same as it is on Windows? I can say that I don't think it's because Microsoft wanted to sell more copies of Windows and intentionally made Mac Excel a little bit different and had fewer features. I just don't think that's the case. Throughout the years, there have been some organizational setups at Microsoft which kind of led to this. There were separate development teams, there were separate code bases, but back in 2018, those code bases came together and the organizations came together. So there was one engineering team working on Excel for Mac and Excel for Windows. And at that time, I was working on that project. We were able to close the gap. So many features that didn't exist on Excel for Mac all of a sudden were available on Excel for Mac. And then for the next few years, we worked very hard to try to add more and more features. And if you looked at this presentation 6 years ago, it would be a lot longer than what I'm going to show you today. But there are some differences that still exist, and I'm going to go through all those differences, or the ones that I think are at least notable, and we'll help you answer that question of whether you can do real work in Excel for Mac. I'll address the elephant in the room. Why wait for this one? So the big feature that's missing in Excel for Mac that a lot of people talk about is the data model, or Power Pivot. The reason that this doesn't exist on Mac is not because Microsoft doesn't want it there. It does. But Power Pivot was initially developed on Windows, and it uses some APIs that exist on the Windows operating system, and those just don't exist on the Mac. So it's not there now, and I don't think it's going to be available on Mac for quite some time. Maybe they'll be able to develop some technology where it's kind of cloud-based and extend that to the Mac, but at this time it's not there, and I don't expect it to be there soon. All right, now I want to talk about a big feature that actually is available on the Excel for the Mac, but I want to talk about it anyway because it's so important. So when I worked at Microsoft, one of the biggest requests we had was for Power Query because it didn't exist. And so a few years ago, we started rolling out updates where at first you could just refresh queries, then you could control the connection for text files a little bit, but you really couldn't do a lot with it. But over time, they've been releasing more and more data sources that you can create queries from. And then just recently, they've actually introduced the Power Query editor. So before this, you could do some fancy VBA if you wanted to do some very minor editing. But now Power Query on Mac Excel has a full-featured query editor, so it's really very powerful. The one thing that's missing is when you load your data, so you don't have the option to just create the connection. You have to load it to the sheet, but I believe that will be coming fairly soon. All right, let's talk about some of the basics. So if you're switching over to a Mac or you're helping someone use a Mac, it's good to know some of these basic things. So let's talk about keyboard shortcuts. Hopefully these are fairly easy if you switch over. On the Mac, you have a control key and a command key. The command key is kind of the typical one that Apple uses for most of the popular shortcuts, and most of those are duplicated for Excel. So for example, if you hit Control C, that will copy, but you can also hit Command C. And likewise, Control V would paste or Command V would paste. So you can use either one. There are some special cases that you need to be aware of, and hopefully you'll learn these quickly if you use those, and that's things like Command F. So Command F will open up this little find in document box in Excel, which is kind of specific to the Mac apps. But if you hit Control F, it will open up the find dialog that you're familiar with that works the same as it does in Excel for Windows. The other one that's a good one to know about is Command H. So Mac uses Command H to hide a window. So you can't open the replace dialog with Command H, but you can open the replace dialog with Control H. So that will bring up Excel's find and replace dialog. Another interesting thing about a Mac is that we have there's still a menu. So even though Excel has a ribbon and all the other Office apps have a ribbon, there's also a menu. So you can do a lot of things on the menu as well. And you can either open that just with the mouse, or you can use Control F2 to put focus there. And then you can just use the arrow keys to get through the menu. One big thing that's missing, and hopefully it will be there eventually, are the Alt key tips. So on Windows, you can just tap the Alt key and it brings up key tips across all the buttons on the ribbon and lets you access those very easily. That doesn't exist on Excel for Mac. There is a place you can go and vote for it. So if you go to Excel's suggestion box, which I have the link to on this slide, you can go and vote and tell them that this is important, and the team actually does listen to those suggestions. So I encourage you to go and vote for that. If you want to get to it, you can do aka.ms/Excel suggestions. Okay, I want to talk about some things that you can do on the Mac that you can't do on Windows, and there are a few things, and I'll cover more of those later in the presentation. The first one is about customizing your keyboard shortcuts. So right within Excel for Mac, you can actually customize the keyboard. I won't go into too much detail here, but if you go to the Tools menu, you can choose Customize Keyboard, and you get a dialog like this where you can search for a command, and then you can assign your own key combination to it, and then you'll be able to use that in Excel. The other thing you can do on Mac is assign keyboard shortcuts to any app really, and this is done through the Mac OS preferences. So you can go to the keyboard setup there, you have to pick the application you want, and then you can assign a keyboard shortcut to any item that appears on the menu. So that's very useful if you have a menu item that exists and you want to just assign a key combination to that. Okay, another thing that's important to know on Mac is how to get to your context menus. So by default, there's no right click on a Mac. So if you're using the trackpad, or if you have a mouse that's made by Apple that only has one button, you don't know how to get the context menu open, there are a few options. You can either hold down the Control key and click. That's the same as right clicking. You can use Shift F10 on your keyboard. So if you have focus on a cell, for example, you can hit Shift F10 and it will open up the context menu for the cell. You can buy a mouse that has more than one button. So I use a Microsoft mouse with my MacBook, and that I can just right click naturally on there. And there's also a trackpad option where you can set it up to do a secondary click. And there's a few different ways that can do that. One thing I really enjoy about the ribbon on Windows that's missing on Mac, unfortunately, is the little tiny button in some of the sections of the ribbon where you can click and expand into the detailed dialog for that section. So you can see in the little video that I have here, it clicks on the little corner of the number section of the ribbon, and that opens up the number formatting dialog. I really like that, especially for working with shapes and images and things like that open up the side pane. So you can open all those things up on Mac, but usually you end up having to click a button. For example, you'd have to click the number formatting menu, and at the bottom of it, it would say more formats, and that will open up the dialog. So it's just not quite as easy as on Windows. Now back to something that is only available on Mac that I wish was available on Windows, and so do other people, is the eyedropper to pick colors. So basically in every app where you have a color picker on Mac, you get this little option where you can click more colors, and then it will open up a secondary dialog, and you have this little eyedropper icon, and when you click that, it opens up a little zoom box, and you can go anywhere on your screen and pick out any color that appears on your screen. This doesn't exist in Excel on Windows. It kind of exists in in PowerPoint for Windows, and you can see I have a screenshot here. There is an eyedropper in PowerPoint. The thing is it's only able to pick a color from within your presentation. It doesn't go across your entire screen. So I really like the one that Mac has in all the apps. So here's a minor thing, but I think it's worth mentioning. So Excel, the application running kind of works differently than on Windows. So when you close all your documents in one of the Office apps on Windows, the application shuts down. There's no other Excel running in the background. On Mac, if you close all your Excel workbooks, Excel will keep running. So it's not a huge difference, but it does make it a little bit quicker sometimes if you want to close all your documents and then you open something else. Excel doesn't have to start up again. It's already running. So it can make it a little bit faster. On the other hand, it is a good idea sometimes to restart your apps because maybe they're using more memory than they should and it can get cleaned up. So I like this feature on Mac, but it's not super important. Now here's a bit of a gotcha. This is something that I find not very good on Mac, and I wish the Excel and Office team would fix this. And that's what happens when you go to save a copy of a file. So ordinarily on Windows, if you open a file and you want to make a copy of it, you click Save As or Save a Copy, and it will default to putting that file, the new file, in the same folder where you opened the source file. On Mac, it's different. So on Mac, if you open a file from one folder and then you hit Save a Copy, it goes into some other folder. It's your default folder, but it's not the folder that was the same location as the source file. So just be aware of that when you open up this dialog. Most likely it's not going to be in the same folder that you're expecting, especially if you use Windows. So you have to go and pick the right folder and then do your save. So just be aware of that and be careful with it. Now let's get into some specifics about actually using Excel. So when you're writing formulas, there's some helpful things. And one thing that's missing on Mac that I really like on Windows is this little tooltip that tells you about the function name. So you can see in my little video here, as I'm going up and down the function list, it tells me what this count function does and what the count A function does. And I can see very easily without having to remember that count just counts the cells that have numbers, and then count A does cells that are not empty. There's a big difference there, and you want to make sure you can pick the right one. Unfortunately on Mac, it doesn't give you that little bit of help. So if you're not sure, then you have to go somewhere else and look it up and see how it works, or test it and see how it works. And it's just not very helpful. So the other thing that it's a little bit more subtle, but on Windows, when you're using your cursor to move through the text in a formula, you can see it kind of just animates the brackets a little bit. As you go past one, it'll highlight where the closing bracket or opening bracket is for that one. You don't get that on Mac. It still color codes them, but it just doesn't do the highlighting. Okay, another thing about writing formulas is the formula builder. So if you like to use this, maybe you're familiar with on Windows, if you click the FX button, it opens the formula dialog, which you can see here, and it kind of leads you through how to fill out the arguments for the function. On Mac, it's very similar, but it's open in a pane instead of a dialog. So I think you'll find out, you can use this very similar. The one thing that's a little bit confusing, I think, is that when you get finished writing your function or your formula on Mac, you can click the Done button, but it keeps that formula pane open, where on Windows, you click the OK button and it closes that dialog out. It can be a little confusing to keep the pane there on Windows. Sorry, on Mac. Another tool for helping you work on your formulas is the debugging tool called Evaluate Formula. This is a feature that's missing from Mac Excel, unfortunately. This is another one that a lot of people requested over the years. Unfortunately, it was never actually implemented, but I think there's a pretty good workaround to that. The recent feature called Value Preview is something I would really encourage you to use. You can see in the little video here, this is Value Preview working on the Mac, and inside this formula, basically, it's showing that you can click in the tooltip for the function, and it will select the parts of that function making up a particular argument. So in this case, logical test, and then value if false. And then there's a little tooltip that pops up and shows you the value of that part that you've highlighted. So that's a really nice way that you can, check what's happening in your formulas. It's not the same as the Evaluate Formula dialog where you could kind of step through everything, but I think it is really nice and helpful, and it's just inline. You don't have to open a separate dialog. So on Windows, you have both options, but I tend to prefer using the Evaluate Formula myself, or sorry, the Value Preview tooltips myself. Okay, staying with formulas, there are some functions that are not supported on Mac. So you can see here, encode URL, filter XML, and the web service function are not supported on Mac. These actually rely on some operating capabilities that exist on Windows. They just won't work on Mac. If you have a spreadsheet that has one of these already in it that was created on Windows, then what you'll see when you open it up on Mac is something like this. This little underscore XLFN basically is talking about a function that may be there available in the future, but Excel, the current version of Excel that you have, isn't aware of it, and you'll get a pound name error down in the cell. And you can see in this case, it actually gives you, if you click on the little error drop-down list, it shows you that this is an unsupported function. Okay, let's talk about VBA. So the good news is that most VBA code will work across Mac and Windows. There are, of course, differences because the operating systems are different. So certain things need special handling, like anything that deals with the operating system directly, like there are some commands to deal with file system objects, opening files, looking through directories, things like that. Those are going to be different and may need special handling. There are some good online resources for that, so I think you can find those if you need it. And then there's one big difference in terms of actual what's supported and what's not supported, and that is user forms. So user forms, the good news is they can be run on Mac Excel. They just can't be created and edited. So I just wanted to show you that here. So this is the Lambda Explorer from Decision Models and Charles Williams, who is also a presenter at this conference. And you can just see that user form running over on Windows, and it's also over here on the right running on Mac, and they look very much the same, and they both work. So that's the good news. Unfortunately, if you wanted to modify that user form, you wouldn't be able to do it on Mac, but hopefully in a lot of cases that's not necessary. Okay, one thing that's different about Mac is flash fill. So it's not that flash fill doesn't exist on the Mac, it does exist, it's just not automatic. So on Windows, if you're typing, and you can see in the example here, I've typed a few values in a new column, and then it shows me a preview in a little bit lighter font of what all the values would be if I filled those down through the column. And then you can just hit enter and it kind of accepts those automatically for you. On Mac, yeah, flash fill will still work, but you need to know about it. So in this case, down the bottom here, I would have typed in the first value or maybe two values, And then I need to know that I want to use flash fill, so I can either do that by hitting Control E or pressing the flash fill button up on the ribbon, and it will do the same thing. It's just that for people who aren't familiar or aren't aware of flash fill, it's just not going to work for them. So don't get tripped up that it doesn't exist. It does exist, but you need to invoke it or trigger it yourself. Again, I'm highlighting a feature here that it actually works the same now on Excel for Mac as it does on Windows, but I wanted to highlight this because it's recent. So autocomplete for drop-down lists, and these are data validation drop-down lists. This has worked for about a year or so on Windows. It's just now getting rolled out on Mac. So it's really nice that if you have a drop-down list in a cell, instead of having to scroll down and pick the item from the list, you can just start typing and it will filter the list out for you and make it much easier to find. Again, that exists on Mac, but it's a very recent addition. Okay, back to features that just don't exist. So the quick analysis lens is something that it was a popular request when I was working on Excel for Mac. And this is where you can highlight a range and then you get the little button at the bottom, and that lets you pick either some quick actions like adding conditional formatting, adding a chart, inserting a pivot chart, just turning it into a table. That's what you can see here in this little video I have going. Again, that just doesn't exist on Mac, so if you're working with someone or training someone and they are trying to follow along on the Mac, they just won't be able to do this part. And likewise, another thing missing from Mac is this little button that appears when you select a chart, or these series of buttons. So normally you can click on those buttons and let you add an element to the chart or change the formatting or even do filtering. Again, this just doesn't exist on Mac. So if you're working with someone and they just can't follow along, that's the reason. It's not just that they have something, switched off on their instance of Excel. All right, let's talk about conditional formatting. So what I'm showing you to start off is that the menus are actually the same, even though they have a slightly different look and feel. They're organized the same way and they all have the same options. So you can see here on the left is Mac and on the right is Windows, and everything's the same. It's just the way that they look is a little bit different, but they don't actually behave differently. But what is a little bit different is once you get into the dialogues. So what you can see here on the Windows dialog on the right is just as soon as you open up to create a new rule, you have some choices at the top, and then depending on what you pick at the top, it will change the options that you have at the bottom. The Mac one is laid out a little bit differently. On the Mac, the first dialog gives you the choice that you see at the bottom on Windows, and then you actually have to click on the drop-down list and change it to get the choices that you have on the Windows. So first you would click on the drop-down basically from the default option, which is 2-color scale. If you want to have all the options that you see on Windows, you need to go down the list and choose Classic. And then once you get Classic, it has another drop-down below which has all the options that you can see on Windows initially as soon as you open that dialog. All right, moving on, let's talk about filter dialogues. There are some differences here, and I'll point those out. Hopefully you can still function just fine. It's just really pointing these out that things are in different places, and if you're trying to help somebody who switched over from Windows, or if you've switched over from Windows, it's just good to know about these differences. The main thing is that Mac has this auto apply. So by default, when you start making selections in your filter, they automatically get applied and you'll see your data in the background automatically being filtered. You can turn that off. So if you have a lot of data, the auto apply can actually slow things down, so you can shut it off and then make a whole bunch of selections before it starts applying them. But on Windows, it doesn't auto apply ever. You make your selections and click OK to apply those. A couple other things that are different, it's just the clear filter shows up at the bottom as a button on Mac, where it shows up as one of the menu items up a little bit above on Windows. There's the ability to control the sheet view on Windows. That just doesn't exist in the dialog on Mac. And then to do the custom filter, so like if you want to go to text filters on Windows, you would go to text filter and then open up this dialog where you can put in something like, in this case, does not contain, and I put in a string there, like I think it says question tights or asterisk tights. So that dialog gives you a little hint about how to use wildcard characters. On Mac, it will still work. You can do the same query or the same filter. So here I'm showing does not contain, but it's right in line, and it doesn't have the nice hint to tell you what the wildcards are, but they do still work. And now I want to just highlight, there is one important difference that I didn't have on the previous one, which is when you're searching for values in your value list. So on Windows, it has this really nice ability where you can start searching your list, and then you can make some selections, and then you can choose add current selection to filter, and then you could search for something else, and you could add that to your filter, and all those selections are added to your filter. So it's really nice if you have, like in this case, I'm searching for bike, and I can pick things that relate to bikes. But if I wanted to search for something else like shorts, I could search for that and add that to the filter, and then I'd see bike and shorts in my list. On Mac, that option is just missing. I have the red line here just showing where it would be. But in Mac, when you search for bike, it brings up options that have bike in it, and then you can pick from those, but you can't add that to some existing selection. So it's just a little bit less flexible. And now let's talk about sorting, in particular pivot table sorting. So there are a few differences that you should be aware of. So what I'm showing here for the Mac is that the custom sorting is just right in line with the dialog. So in this case, category is the field name, and I want to sort by one of the value fields. So in this, I was able to just choose sum of sales right in the dialog. On Windows, you would have to click more sort options, and then you could click sum of sales in the dialog that pops up and do that. So it's a little bit easier on Mac. However, on Windows, then you have more options. So you can set it to manually sort by just dragging. And then on Mac, you don't have the option to select to do it manually, but you can just go to your pivot table and just start dragging things, and then it will choose that option. You don't have the option to turn on or off the sort automatically on refresh. So that's something important that you have on Windows that you don't have on Mac. So just be aware of that. You can get to the similar dialog on Mac. You have to do that through the context menu. So again, back to one of the shortcuts, you can either control click to bring up the context menu, or you can press Shift F10 on your keyboard and then choose more sort options from the menu, and then you'll get this dialog that you see here. But again, there are just a few options that are missing on Mac. And sticking with pivot tables, there are some differences in filtering that you should be aware of. So on Mac, the filter dialog, when you try to filter a value, has no way to pick which field you're filtering on. So if you look at the pivot table I have here in the background, I want to filter the accessories column, the row labels column. In this case, it has accessories as a category. But maybe I don't want to filter it by sum of sales. I want to filter it by one of the other fields in there. By default on Mac, if you just put a value in the filter here, like I chose greater than and put in 19,000, it's going to filter the very first column in the pivot table. On Windows, when you try to do this, it actually leads you to open up a dialog, and you have to pick which field you want, and then you can put in your filter criteria. So you can actually do this on Mac, but again, you need to know this shortcut to open up the context menu. So you can see in the little video here, you can either control click or press Shift F10 while you have your cell focused on one of the cells in the rows column. That's going to bring up the menu. You can go down to filter and then choose value filters, and then it brings up the dialog where you can pick which field you want to filter on. So a very important thing to know, and you'll need to use the context menu to be able to do that. Okay, another thing for pivot tables to be aware of is that when you go to the pivot table field settings dialog, there's a few things you can do on Windows that you can't do on Mac. So if you look at the screenshot I have here, it's opening up the field settings, and basically what I'm showing here is that there's a layout and print tab on Windows, and then if you look at the pivot table in the background, I'm able to change the layout just for the first column. So in the first column, I really wanted that to be in outline format, but I want the rest of it to be in tabular format to kind of bring all the other columns underneath it and save some space. And it's simple to do on Windows because it's available in the dialog. There's just no way to do that using the field settings dialog on Mac. There is a solution to it using VBA. We're going to actually publish a blog about how to do that very soon on the Sun Product blog, so keep an eye out for that. It involves a little VBA, but it doesn't need to go into the workbook that you're affecting. You can put it in your personal macro workbook, and then you'll be able to adjust any pivot table this way. Pivot table defaults, unfortunately, don't exist on Mac. Or I should say the ability to change the defaults doesn't exist on Mac. So on Windows, you can go into your Excel options and choose edit the default layout, and then you can pick from all the different options for a pivot table and set those so that every time you create a new pivot table, it will use the defaults that you like. You can even create a pivot table, set it up the way you like, and then you can use this little import button to pick the pivot table, and then we'll import all those settings for you, which is really nice. So then you don't have to go through the same setup process every time you create a pivot table. Unfortunately, this just doesn't exist on Mac either. For pivot charts, we actually have some good and bad news, and then they're the same thing. So the bad news is that you don't get these little buttons that show up on your pivot chart. A lot of people don't like those, and they just remove those the first thing they do when they create a pivot chart. In Windows, I'm one of those people. I just think they don't look nice, so I take them off of my chart. But they're useful. So if you wanted to do a filter, you can do that right on the chart itself. And you can see in the screenshots here just the difference. Those buttons don't exist on Mac. I like not having them there, but there's no. If I did want them there, there's no way that I could add it. All right, getting back to something you can do on Mac that you can't do on Windows, and that's what we call click to add mode. Click to add mode was something that existed in a much older version of Excel for Mac, and actually was taken away at some point. And then lots of users on Mac really complained and said, we want that feature back. So we were able to add that back. And it's basically, as you can see here in the video, it's just where you start creating a formula, you type equals, and then you can just click on cells and we'll just add those together. So it just puts the plus sign in there for you and then puts the cell reference wherever you click. It's an option that you can turn on. It's not on by default. By default, the behavior would be the same as it is on Windows, but you can turn that on just going to the Excel preferences and then edit and enable click to add mode. All right, another way I think that Excel for Mac is a little bit better, I think it's a little bit smarter. So auto recover is really nice on Excel for Mac. Basically, you just have to enable it. It just optimizes itself. So when you turn on auto recover and you're just working in Excel, it will always basically create the auto recover version so that if you crash, you don't lose any work. And it's optimized continually as you work. So if you have a really big file that takes a minute to save, the auto recover is going to save that a little bit less frequently. It's going to try to not interfere with what you're doing by having the save happening in the background. But if you're working on a small file that just takes less than a second to save, it's going to be saving that auto recover file very frequently, so that if you do get a crash, it's almost guaranteed you're just not going to lose any work. On Windows, it's a little bit different. So on Windows, by default, it saves the auto recovery information every 10 minutes. I like to set mine down to 1 minute, so I have the smallest amount of work lost if there's a crash. But it's just a fixed number of minutes, where on Mac, it just optimizes itself all the time, and it's pretty nice. All right, removing private information. This is something that's important. If you ever want to save a file and share it with somebody else, and you're afraid that there's private information in there, it's a really good idea to check that and make sure it doesn't have private information. On Windows, they make this easy with the doc inspector. It's actually called Inspect Document. If you look in the backstage, or you click File, then you can go to check for issues, and then you have a bunch of different options here, one of which is Inspect Document. And this has a whole list of different things it's checking for to see if there's any place where you could have private information that you don't want to disclose to somebody else. So you can go through and remove all of that. And it's pretty easy and it's pretty powerful. That's missing on Mac. Instead, what you get is this checkbox. So if you go into the preferences and choose security, you can enable remove personal information from this file and save. I want to make sure everyone's clear. It's definitely not as comprehensive as it is on Windows. This is really going to just pull out private information that would exist in the file properties, such as the last author or the person who last saved the file. It's not going to go in and check and tell you about all the different things that exist in the file where there could be private information. Windows will do that, and it's a really handy feature to use when you're sharing a file. And sticking with security, there's also the Trust Center and macro security is a lot more limited in Mac. So on Windows, you have a lot of control over what happens with not only macros, but other things like trusted publishers, trusted locations, trusted documents, things like that. The concept of a trusted document doesn't exist on Mac. So a lot of times if you open up a workbook on Windows that has a macro in it, you'll maybe enable the macros, but then you get prompted to say, do you want to trust this document? So that in the future, when you open it up, it doesn't have to ask you that question. On Mac, it will always ask you the question. You can't set it to be trusted. So the security options are a little bit more limited. You can still go in and set things so that macros are either disabled always without notification, or you can be notified, or you can actually set it to enable all macros. This is definitely not recommended, and Microsoft puts that right in the dialog box there. So just be aware of that. The security, there's some things that the Mac operating system provides in a way of security. So there's what's called a sandbox there, and that's effective, but it doesn't have this granular capability that you have on Windows. Okay, another thing that's missing from Mac, I kind of saved it toward the end because I don't think it's as important as a lot of people think. There have been a lot of requests for this through the years of why can't we add the forecast sheet to Mac, and in reality it's just a wizard. So on Windows you can click this forecast sheet button, and then it will guide you through creating a forecast based on your existing data. But basically all it's doing is guiding you through how to create a formula. So you can certainly build that same formula on Mac. You just need to have the data. So you can see here in the screenshot at the bottom, I have the time periods, I have my sales data, and then I can create my forecast using the forecast function. That's the exact same one that would be created by the wizard. I just need to know to use the forecast.ets function and some related functions, and then I can create the exact same forecast and create a chart just like you would see on Windows. So it's kind of missing, but the capability is there. You just have to know how to get to it. Again, a relatively minor thing, but I just want to mention about language switching. So if you're someone that needs to work in different languages in Excel, I find it to be a little bit easier on Mac, a little bit easier to control overall, but not a big thing. It's just different. On Mac, you set the language in your Mac OS preferences. So you can see in the screenshot here, I actually have the language and region settings from the Mac OS preferences. And here I set English currently as my top language, but I can drag one of the others up if I wanted to. And then next time I launch any of the apps on any of the apps on my Mac, it will use that language. What's really cool on Mac is that you can pick a language for a specific application. So what I show here is that I've added Microsoft Excel as one of my applications, and then I can go in there and I can choose a different language just for Excel, and then everything else will be unaffected. But when I relaunch Excel, it'll show up in that language. So it's kind of neat. All the languages are just built in. There's nothing more to download. So on Windows, if you go to install a new language, you actually have to install it. It downloads something, and then you set the language within Excel rather than at the OS level. So you can tell it to follow the operating system, but you're actually setting it within Excel. So I think it's just a little bit nicer and quicker and smoother on Mac. Finally, I just want to mention a few other features. I also want to make a disclaimer that I don't think this presentation is absolutely comprehensive on all the differences between Excel and Mac and Windows. I think there are still some things that they work differently, and I didn't mention. Hopefully, they're the less important ones, but I will mention a few others without going into all the details. Published at Power BI is not available on Mac. Also, the add-ins Spreadsheet Inquire and Spreadsheet Compare. Those are COM add-ins that work if you have the higher level licenses. On Windows, you may have seen those or used those, but they're COM add-ins and they just don't work on Mac. There's also the Pivot Table Wizard, or some people call it the Consolidate Range Wizard. That doesn't exist on Mac. But the good news is that now with Power Query, I'd say that's a much more recommended way of consolidating your data if you want to do pivot tables on data that's on different sheets, for example. The Pivot Table Wizard was something from years ago. I think even on Windows, it's kind of hidden. So Power Query is definitely the way to go for that. The XML map pane and XML tools don't exist on Mac. Just like what we saw with the web service function, the XML pane uses the operating system level APIs, and those don't exist on Mac. So those tools also don't work on Mac. For OLE, which is object linking and embedding, some of the things there you can do. It's not working exactly the same way as it does on Windows, but one of the ones that is a little bit more important is inserting a PDF as an icon. So you can have a PDF as an icon on Windows, and you can double click and it will just open up as a PDF document. On Mac, if you try to do that, it just doesn't work. And then finally, ActiveX controls. So hopefully none of you are using those. It's kind of an older technology, but it's also Windows-based technology. It's never going to be available on Mac. But the good news is you can use form controls instead. Those are things that are just kind of unique to the Office apps and Excel. So if you go to your developer tab and you want to insert a form control, definitely do that and stay away from the ones that are called ActiveX. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. I just want to say thank you to everyone who joined in live or is listening on the recording. And hopefully now you can answer this question with a lot more information that you had before. So maybe you already been working in Excel for Mac. Maybe you're not. Maybe you know now that you can because it allows you to do everything you need. Or maybe you're not so sure. And then for those of you who need Power Pivot and Data Model, I'm sure you're going to say no way. But again, thanks for joining, and I really appreciate your attention. Now to the obligatory evaluation slide. We really do appreciate your attention, but we appreciate even more if you give us some feedback about it. So please go on and fill out the evaluations for any sessions that you've seen. Hopefully you've had a good experience, but we would love to hear from you. So that brings us to the very end. Again, thank you. If you want to contact me with questions, I'd be happy to take those. I have my LinkedIn information there or my email address. Feel free to reach out to me, and I'd love to help you out with any issues you have or just give you more information. Thank you.
Steve, some great tips there. Look, let's fire straight into the questions, if I may. The first one I've got here is it's actually, you mentioned Power Query towards the end. One of the questions I get quite regularly is, what is the deal with Power Query on Mac? Because people keep hearing different things. Can you do everything in there? Are there things that are limited? What's the gen?
Yeah, so I think you can do basically everything once you get the data in. So there are some limitations in terms of what the data sources can be. So if you go into get data on Windows, you see many different data sources that you can pick from. If you do the same thing on Mac, the number of data sources is smaller. The main ones are already there, like text files, Excel files, databases, things like that. And then there's just some that are missing. I think they're gradually adding some, so Microsoft knows they want to have parity so that people can do the same work on Mac as they can do on Windows. I think the big one that's missing for me right now is pulling data from a table or a range. I think that will be coming, before too long, but it's not there now, and that's kind of a useful one. So I guess you have to just look at what connectors are available and make the decision at this point. But once you get your data into Power Query and you're in the editor, in the editing environment, I'm not aware of any limitations that exist there. So you should be able to do everything you need to do.
No, fair enough. Another question I've got here in terms of here is that some people, this is going back a little while, is it worth putting Parallels or something else like that on and put a Windows operating system on a Mac, or does that just defeat the whole purpose of getting a Mac?
No, I don't think it does. In fact, I've had experience using Parallels on a Mac where the Windows operating system running within there, and so just so everyone's clear, when you run Parallels, it's like running a virtual machine. So your Mac is still running, you can still do things in other apps, but then you have this Parallels app where you can run a Windows machine. And I actually had a Windows machine that would perform better in that virtual environment than my Lenovo laptop at the time. So, and I can say from recent experience with a new MacBook, the M2 chip, the custom chips that Apple made really had boost of performance. And I think I haven't actually used Parallels on this new MacBook, but I can only imagine that it's even better than what I experienced on the old MacBook that I had.
So that takes me there, because I know you're working with the MacBook at the moment with us. Which do you prefer personally? It's okay, you're allowed. Are you more of a PC or a MacBook user then, Steve?
It's tough. I'd say I tend to use the Windows machine a little bit more. I know people say through the years that, oh, Macs are just so easy to use and all that, but honestly, I think if you're switching over from Windows to Mac, it takes quite a while before you start to feel like you're an expert at it. There's so many keyboard shortcuts to do different things that you just have to know, and so many different things that are really, really nice and easy to, or friendly once you know how to do it on Mac. But discovering it and actually doing it, I think, is a bit harder than on Windows. So I do like both. The one thing that on all the different devices I've had, the battery life has been much better on the Macs than on my Windows devices. So that's something I love.
No, fair enough. And so, and another question that people ask me sometimes about this, because on our website we do seem to have more on the piece. Do you think that Excel for Mac, the literature compared to what's available for Excel for Windows, it's neglectful? There's not as much out there, or do you think there's as rich a resource out there in the world of the interwobble?
I mean, there are specific things for Mac. I guess in general, most of the literature out there is applicable to Windows. And then there's some that's special for Mac that's a much, much smaller set. But the hope is that everything you learn about writing formulas and functions and charting and pivot tables and all that is applicable to the Mac. So you're right, there is less information about the Mac, but I think it's just natural that that's the case.
Okay. Now, don't forget here, we've got a few more minutes before Ken is going to be chomping at the bit with his session on Boost Your Excel Efficiency for Monkey Tools. Please go in the Q&A if you've got any questions for Steve, though, and Steve's happy to take them. Just while we're waiting to see if there's any more questions coming through there. Steve, I asked this question regularly. It's one of my fallback ones here. What would be your top 3 tips for Excel for Mac?
Ooh, top 3 tips. I think hopefully I covered them all.
Top 5 or top 1?
Yeah.
Whichever.
No. One really top one that's so basic, and I should have mentioned it on the presentation that I forgot, was switching between workbooks or switching between documents, for that matter, in any app on the Mac. Instead of pressing Alt-Tab, so I press Alt-Tab all day long on my Windows machine, and I've had lots of customers in the past send feedback in saying, I hate the Mac, I can't switch between my documents with Alt-Tab. And they just need to know that the shortcut is Command, and then it's the button above Tab that has like the little tilde or something on. I don't even know what it's called, but it works the same way. It's just not the Tab button. So that's a great tip. And I think let me try to think of one other good one. Yeah, I guess from my perspective, I try to, hopefully everything that I've shown in the presentation covers kind of what you need to know. So in terms of like something great you can do on Mac, I don't really have any other great tips for you.